There's a painting that I like a lot that I want to share with you. It's by a 16th century Italian painter. His name was Caravaggio. And he was a really famous painter. He inspired Rembrandt and others. But he has this painting called The Calling of St. Matthew. And I like this painting a lot. If you don't know, it's the biblical story of how Jesus goes to the house of Matthew, who's a tax collector, and calls him to be one of his disciples. And there's a lot of context in here that kind of explains what's going on in this. But to keep it short, I'll just say this, right? If you read the New Testament, you see that tax collectors are often listed in this list of what the religious elite in Jesus' day would have considered like the sinners, the undesirables, like tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, drunkards, right? These sorts of people. Tax collectors are always included in that list. And they're always complaining that Jesus is welcoming these sinners and these tax collectors, and he even goes to their house and eats with them. And Caravaggio captures this painting. In this instance, Jesus is going to the house of this particular tax collector to invite him to be one of his disciples, his select followers. He doesn't just eat in his house. He's giving him this great honor. Now, to understand why Jewish people during this time hated tax collectors, maybe some of you are like, no, I get it. I pay taxes too. I understand the hatred for tax collectors. But it's a little bit deeper than that in their world. Tax collectors were people who collected taxes for Rome, who controlled Israel at this time. They were people who had sold out their countrymen. They were traitors, right? They were collaborators with the oppressors. And in order to get rich themselves, right, they oppressed their own people to help Rome raise money so Rome could fund its armies and its wars and these sorts of things. The tax collectors were so hated. They were just like shunned from society. No respectable Jewish person would find themselves eating dinner with the likes of a traitor like a tax collector. But Jesus does. He goes to his house, he eats dinner, and then he invites Matthew to come and follow him as one of his disciples. Now, the reason I like this painting is because of something that's a little bit weird about it. You can tell who Jesus is. He's over on the right. The picture isn't really bright here, but he's over on the right. He's got just a little hint of a halo right above his head. His arm is outstretched, kind of the way that Michelangelo paints the hand of God in the creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel. And he's dressed in the traditional way that someone in Jesus' day would be dressed. But then everybody else at the table is dressed differently, right? This is the peculiar aspect of this painting. They're dressed like the people who were in the Italian marketplace in Caravaggio's day. They're dressed in the fashion of their day. I remember one time I was walking through a museum, and I was walking with a friend of mine, and we saw a painting, not this painting, but one like it, and she's like, oh man, I hate these paintings. I hate them so much. I was like, I kind of like them. Like, why do you hate them? And she says, they're just so arrogant, right? Like these late medieval painters who think that like they're the height of civilization and somehow they have to insert themselves into the painting so they would draw the world like it looked to their eyes. And I said, oh, no. You don't understand. Like that's not what Caravaggio was trying to do at all. Here's what Caravaggio wanted to do. He wanted his audience to see themselves in the painting. Right? He wanted the audience to be able to place themselves at the table as if Jesus was in the room calling them to come and follow him. It's like once upon a time, Jesus called sinners to repentance. And now, Jesus is still calling sinners to repentance. If Caravaggio painted this painting today, you know, like everybody around the table would be in like hoodies and half of them would be wearing Crocs. The ladies would be in like tights from Lululemon. Well, I guess they are in tights already. But like everybody would they would be dressed in the way that you're dressed today. Because Caravaggio, the genius of his painting is he wanted to take the story of Scripture and he wanted people to understand that it's not just a story that happened once upon a time, but it's a story that continues to happen again and again. And Jesus is still calling sinners to repentance. He wanted you, his audience, to see themselves in the painting. I tell you that because we're starting a series today on parables. And most of the parables we're going to talk about are the parables of Jesus. If you've grown up in church, maybe you've heard a definition of parables like the one I heard when I was little, that parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. right? That Jesus, in order to make his message acceptable to the people, that he would tell them stories drawn from their world. There would be stories about sheep and shepherds and farming and the stuff that made up their day-to-day life in Palestine at the time. And people would see that, and Jesus would sort of download some sort of spiritual message into that, and they would understand it more clearly. Right? And I guess that's a fine definition as far as it goes, but parables are a little bit more than that. Right? For one thing, Jesus does something that's really interesting, is he would often tell them stories where they were so common that the people in his audience could basically guess what was going to happen next. And then Jesus doesn't give them what they think is going to happen next. Instead, he inverts it, or he changes it, or he shocks his audience by giving them something that they're just not really expecting. In fact, there's a lot going on in parables, more than just like one simple idea, one simple heavenly meaning in this earthly story. Kenneth Bailey, who's spent as long a time as anyone I know trying to understand the Middle Eastern context of Jesus' day in order to understand his parables better, said parables are more like a house. Right? When you go into a house, there's lots of space to explore. There's lots of rooms and doors, and there's windows that look out on the scenery around. And if you really want to understand a parable, you got to get inside. You got to walk around. You got to look out the windows and see the world through the frame that the house provides. So today, I want to climb inside one of Jesus' parables. I want us to see ourselves in the story. I want us to walk around and explore a little bit of what Jesus is trying to say in one of his most famous parables. It's a parable we call the prodigal son, although that's probably not the best title for it. It comes in Luke chapter 15. It actually comes in an extended context. We'll talk about that a little bit later as Jesus is having a conversation mostly with the religious elite, right? The Pharisees, those who tried their best to keep God's law and to tell everybody else to do the same. But they were complaining about Jesus because Jesus kept welcoming sinners and eating dinner with them. It's just not something you do. One piece of cultural context that's helpful to this is understanding that the Middle East at this time, it's not an individualized context like ours. It's a community context, right? Many of these places where people lived were small villages. Everyone knew everyone. And one of the ways that you kept the village together, right? You kept the community together is you lived according to certain roles. And if you stepped outside of those roles, the community kind of had a role to bring everybody back into it, right? So if you were one of these sinners, these tax collectors, these people who had abandoned the ways of God, the community would shun you. They wouldn't go and eat dinner with you, because to eat dinner with someone in this context was to say that you accept them. Maybe not, you don't accept their behavior, but you accept them as part of the community. And Jesus kept eating with the wrong people. He kept hanging out with sinners. Now, he hung out with the religious elite too. He went to plenty of dinners at Pharisees' houses, but he kept eating with these tax collectors and sinners, and the religious were like, why would he do this? You know, some of his teaching is kind of interesting. Maybe he has some cool things to say, but like if he truly was a prophet of God, he would know who these people are, and he wouldn't like lower himself to go and eat in their homes. And so Jesus tells them some stories to try and help them understand how maybe they're missing what God is up to. This is the parable of the prodigal son. It says, Jesus continued. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Now, already, people who are listening in Jesus' day, their ears would have perked up because a few things happened here that really shouldn't have happened. Because as a son in this culture, your job was to respect your father. Like the elders of the community, they commanded respect. They expected respect. And if you didn't provide it, right, the community had ways of like helping you come back into line. And a younger son going up to his father and saying, "Hey, Dad, I want my inheritance now." That would have been unheard of. That would have been unthinkable. Because what this son is saying is, "Dad, I know when you die, I get my inheritance then, and I kind of have some freedom to do what I want, but I want that freedom now." right? I want to be able to control my own life. I don't want to live under your roof. I don't want to submit to your rules. I don't want to follow your ways. I don't want to do any of that. I want to be free to kind of make my own way in the world. And I cannot wait until you die so that I can do that. So why don't you just let me do it now? It is tantamount to saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. That's how the people would have heard it. And they would have known what the father would do. The father would become irate. He would become angry, and he would punish this son. This son might break his relationship with the father, but he's not going to get his inheritance. But that's not what the father does. See, there's two surprising things so far. The young son asks for his inheritance, something a young man would never do in that culture. And the father freely gives it, something that no one would expect the father to do. But then there's this third thing that's really surprising in this passage that Jesus hearers might have heard, but I wouldn't have seen it if someone hadn't pointed it out to me. And it's this. There's another brother, the older son, and he doesn't do anything. But he should have. When his brother went to his father and said, Dad, I don't want to be a part of this family anymore. Just give me what's mine, and I'm going to go and make my own way. The older brother, the older son, had a responsibility to serve as mediator. His job was to go to his brother and say, what are you doing? What are you thinking? You're breaking your father's heart. You're acting foolishly. You're bringing shame on this family and on this community. What is wrong with you? This isn't how you were raised. And his brother's job was to reconcile the father and his son. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do anything. He just stays silent. And so, not long after us, that the text says, the younger son took his inheritance. He took all he had. And he set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. There was an expectation on this son what he was supposed to do when he received his inheritance. What he was supposed to do is he was supposed to care for it the way that his father and his father and his father had cared for it, because that's what you did. But that's not what the son does. He sells everything. He liquidates his entire inheritance as quickly as he can. He probably sold it as a discount because for whatever reason, he didn't want to go on living in that community. He wanted to sell everything. He wanted to take the money, and he wanted to run, and that's exactly what he did. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. We don't actually know how he spent his money. His brother is going to tell us later on that he squandered it with prostitutes and with wild living and all this. And it says wild living, but that might just mean that he lived lavishly. Because what he would have done in this culture, in this context, is if he went to a new town, nobody really knows who he is, and he would have wanted to demonstrate that he was a person of worth. And the way he would have done that is he would have started throwing big parties. He would have had banquets at his house, and he would have invited all the influential people of town. He would have gave them good gifts, because if he wanted to demonstrate himself as a person of character and virtue and worth, a person that they should welcome into their community, a person who should have influence and power, what he had to do was he had to demonstrate his great wealth through his generosity. So he's got a plan. He's going to take his inheritance, and he's going to buy himself a position of power or influence in this new community that he's chosen through generosity, through living beyond his means. But he has a spate of bad luck. Right as he's running out of his wealth and there's nothing left to draw on, there's a famine in that country. And now even those who were doing well previously, they have nothing to offer. There's no position for him. There's no place. There's no way for him to make his way in this new community. So he goes and he gets himself a job. He went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, verse 15 says, who sent him to the field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. There was this cultural practice at the time. If someone came to you and asked for something, and you didn't want to give it to them, you wouldn't just say no. Right? Because no, it just feels kind of rude. And so what you would do is you would come up with a way of saying no that was more polite. And the way you did that was if someone came and asked you for a job, for example, you would offer them a job, but you would offer them a job that they would never accept. right? Something that was too far beneath them, that didn't pay enough or was in a town far away. And it was kind of a way of saying like, no, I really don't have anything. It was a way of saying no without having to say no. And it seems like it might be what this guy is doing. Everybody knows this kid by now. He's been throwing parties at his house every weekend, right? Everybody's met him. He was a person of wealth, someone who never spent his time out in the fields caring for the flocks and the herds. And he's a Jewish kid. There's no way nobody knows that. And here's one thing we know about Jews. They don't raise pigs. Pigs are unclean. They don't eat pigs. And so this guy looks at this kid and says, sure, you can go and feed the pigs. And what he expects is for this kid to say, no. That's beneath him. And to go and find some other place. But that's not what he does. He takes this job that can only be seen as a disgrace to who he was, to who he is, to who he believes himself to be. And even with this job, he can't provide for himself. He looks at the food that the pigs are eating and he longs to eat it, but no one helps him. All those friends that he thought he had, all that money that he spent to gain influence and to gain popularity, no one helps him now. So then verse 17, he comes up with a different plan. It says, when the boy came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. So he got up and he went to his father. So there's this tradition, this ceremony that awaits this son when he goes home. It's called the kazaza. There's a lot of Z's in this word, so it took me a long time of trying to pronounce it. You don't know how it's spelled, so just take my word for it, that it's something like kazaza is what it looks like when I read it. Here's what it was. When a kid like this, who had shamed his family, especially one who had gone and lost his inheritance, right? Especially one who had gone and lost his inheritance to the Gentiles. When he came back home, there was a ceremony that the town would engage in. The elders of the town, they would come out in front of this kid, and they would take a pot, and they would smash it on the ground. And the symbolism of it was to symbolize that this kid has shattered his relationship, not just with his father, not just with his family, but with the entire community. No one's going to hire this kid in town. No one's going to have him to his house for dinner. No one's going to have pity on him. He's acted like a fool. He's acted disgracefully. He's acted shamefully. And everybody in town is going to let him know. Everybody's going to remind him of who he is and what he's done and what an idiot he's been. The little kids of town are going to follow him around and they're going to ridicule him. The old men of town are going to turn their backs on him. Maybe the reason he took that job feeding pigs is because he knew what waited him at home. But he's like, maybe, just maybe, I can convince my dad to give me a job. Nobody else will, but maybe he'll just give me a job. And then if I can get a job, I can save up money and I can pay back all that inheritance that I squandered. Because if he can pay back the inheritance, he gets to be part of the community again. If he works hard enough and he earns his place, then he can be reconciled to this community that he shattered. That's his plan. But then it says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. There's this way in ancient Middle Eastern village culture, right, that you're supposed to act if you're an elder, if you're a father, if you're a man in town who is worthy of respect. There was a certain way you were supposed to talk. There was a certain way you were supposed to walk. There was a certain way that you carried yourself. It was slow. It was deliberate. Here's what you never did. Old men in these towns, they never ran. That was beneath them. right? They didn't run. In fact, they often didn't go to people. They waited for people to come to them, especially someone like their son, someone who was lower down on the pecking order. And so when this father sees this son, he does something that everyone, when Jesus tells this story, everyone heard it, would have been shocked, right? Everybody in that town would have watched this man who hasn't run in 40 years. He would have hiked up his robes, right, that he was wearing, and he would have ran as fast as he could to go and meet his son. It would have been something that would have been disgraceful. Something that would have looked silly, something that the little kids in town would be making fun of him for years to come. It would have been something shameful. And as he runs through town, because it's so weird and because it's so surprising, everyone is going to come out to see the commotion. See, the father knows what awaits his son. When his son comes back home, they're going to take the pot out, they're going to smash it in front of him, and everyone is going to remind him of what a disgrace he is. Everyone is going to take him, and they're going to put the shame of his actions right in front of him to make him come to terms with who he is and what he's done. And the father, deciding that he would rather take that shame and that disgrace upon himself, saves his son from that embarrassment. He debases himself. He allows himself to be an object of ridicule so that his son doesn't have to face the shame of his actions. And when he gets out there, now that the crowd's all drawn around him, he wants to make sure that nobody misunderstands what he's doing. And so he says to him, I want you to take the best robe in the house. The best robe in the house was his robe, right? Nobody has better clothes in the house than the father. He says, get my best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, put sandals on his feet. We're going to celebrate because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. Here's what the father has done. He has reconciled his son not only to himself, but to the entire community. Because out of respect for this man and his position, while they might despise the son and his actions, out of respect for the father, they would have welcomed this man back into the community. The father takes the shame on himself, reconciles this young, arrogant, ignorant, wayward soul back into the family and back into the community. Now, in the modern West, this is kind of where we stop the parable. Because this is why we call it the parable of the prodigal son. It's about a son who loses his way and comes back home, and the father welcomes him back home. But in Jesus' story, it's only half of the parable. Here's what the rest of it says. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? Your brother has come home, they replied. Your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father, doing something that a father wouldn't do in this time period again, instead of waiting for his son to come to him, right, or demanding that the servants go and drag him back inside, right, the father goes out and meets him out there where he stands refusing to come inside to the party. The father goes out and pleads with him, but he answers his father. It's another scene where everybody's gathered around. Everybody sees what's happening. Everybody in town is going to know about this tomorrow. And this son says to his father, all these years I've slaved away for you. Never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, right? It's not his brother anymore. It's this son of yours. It's like when you were a kid, right? And you got in trouble and your mom would say to your dad, like, go deal with your kids. It's like, well, they're your kids too. Not in that moment, right? It's just his kids, right? Well, this is that moment. He's like, go deal with your son. Not my brother, your son. He squandered all your property with prostitutes. Now he comes home and you kill the fattened calf. The father looks at him and he says, oh, my son, you're always with me. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And the parable's over. I mean, it's not really over. It ends on a cliffhanger because we don't know how the older son is going to respond. right? In this moment, we don't know what he's going to do because this isn't the parable of one lost son. It's the parable of two lost sons. One son breaks his father's heart. He says, I don't want to be a part of this family anymore. Give me what's mine. I'm going to go out and I'm going to make my own way in the world. And then the other son, the supposed good son, the one who stays at home and always obeys his father's order, he too breaks his father's heart. For when this son who was dead, when his brother comes back home, he says, I don't want anything to do with this. And he challenges his father. He disrespects his father. He takes him in front of the whole community and he says, you don't get it. You don't understand who this kid is. You don't understand what he's done. You're making us look foolish. And the father says, oh, you don't understand, right? He's messed up, sure, all that stuff, but he was dead and he's alive again. He's lost and he's found. Come in and celebrate. He pleads with his son to come in and celebrate. The older brother doesn't understand the heart of the father. You know, I like to read biographies. I just finished one on Napoleon, and I've been meaning to read on Napoleon for a while because I've never really liked him. I've kind of always, I read a lot of English history, and Napoleon's not very popular in English history. So I read this biography of Napoleon, and I got to admit, dude was pretty legit, right? Like he's probably the greatest general that's ever lived, according to many historians. He was involved in over 60 battles, right? He only lost 5 of them. Often he was outnumbered. Often he was fighting against multiple nations at the same time. When he goes out as a general and he starts fighting in wars, he begins to engage in tactics that no army had ever seen before. Within 20 years, every army in Europe had reconstituted itself to fight the way that Napoleon fought because he revolutionized warfare. And you know, when I read a biography like that about someone who's a genius, I kind of wonder, like, what would it be like if they were alive today, right? Like, would they still be a genius? Would they still be like this innovator, right? Or was it just that particular moment in time? And I was thinking about that with Napoleon, and then I remembered, like, I don't really have to wonder what Napoleon would be like if he walked among us. Because I was brought up in the 80s and 90s. And so we had this historical documentary, one of Keanu Reeves' best films. It's called Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you've heard of it. Like, I've got the poster right here. You can see Napoleon's right up front in the phone booth, and there's Socrates and Abraham Lincoln, right? A phone booth for the kids. That was the thing where you used to have to go and pay money, right, so that you could call people because you didn't have a phone in your pocket and stuff like that. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure tells the story of Bill and Ted, who are going to set the world right through their music, but they're in danger, right? The band's going to break up because they're going to fail their history class. So George Carlin shows up with a time machine that is a telephone box, and they can go back in history and they can pick up all these historical characters, and they've got to bring them back to 1989, San Dimas, California, so they can see what the modern world is like. And the first person they pick up is Napoleon. It's kind of accidental. And so Napoleon makes his way through 1989, San Dimas, California, and we get to see what Napoleon would be like if he lived in the modern world. If you haven't seen the movie, Napoleon's a big fan of water slides, big fan of ice cream, and he cheats at bowling. That's about what we learn about Napoleon in the modern world. But by the way, I thought about this, and I made myself rewatch the movie for research purposes last night just to make sure I got it right. And I got to tell you, it holds up 100%, no doubt about it. But I really do think sometimes like this, like, what if we transplanted, this famous character from the past and put him in the present? What would they act like? And I was thinking about that because I was thinking about this parable of Jesus. He tells this parable for a reason. Right? In Luke 15, the religious elite are complaining because Jesus eats with sinners. And so he tells them a story. The first story is about a lost sheep. It's about a shepherd who has 100 sheep, 99 are safe at home, one wanders off. And so he wanders out over field and fountain, moor and mountain, traveling wherever he needs to go until he finds that lost sheep and he brings it back home. And then he throws a party for everyone because this lost sheep is now back home. And then he tells a second story about this woman she has 10 coins and she loses one of them, right? Each coin is probably worth a week's wages, maybe even a month's wages. She loses one and she freaks out. So what does she do? She cleans her whole house until she finds that one lost coin. And as soon as she finds it, she throws a party and she celebrates because of her good fortune in finding this coin that was lost. And then, just in case they miss the point, he tells them one more story about 2 lost sons. One who broke his father's heart and went and lived this wild life, right? This sinner, this outcast from his community, the people that Jesus kept eating with, right? And the other about this son who broke his father's heart. Because although he seemed like he listened and he followed all the rules, he really didn't understand what the father was all about. The religious are the older brother, right? The religious in Jesus' day, these Pharisees who are complaining that Jesus eats with sinners and welcomes them, they're the older brother, right? They're the ones who look out and they look at what God is doing in this moment and they're saying, this isn't fair, right? This isn't right. Why would Jesus hang out with these people over there? Why would he love them? Why would he welcome them? Why would he give them any attention? We're the ones who do the work of God. We're the ones who always slave away. We're the ones who keep the law. We're the ones who do what is right. Why isn't Jesus praising us? Why isn't he spending all this time with us? Why does he welcome those who are outcasts instead of spending his time with the community? And just like, you don't get the mission. The mission is to seek and save that which is lost. The problem was the Pharisees didn't realize just how lost they were. Because while they kept certain matters of the law, they forgot about the weightier matters of loving the Father and loving their neighbor. They were lost. They broke the Father's heart because they wouldn't join him in his mission to seek and save that which was lost. They wouldn't come into the party and celebrate when one of these lost sinners returned back home. That's what Jesus said to them. So if Jesus told this story today, what would he say to us? You got to see yourself in the story. My guess is that to some of us, Jesus would speak exactly the way that the Father speaks to that younger son. Seeing us a long way off, right? Our idea is that somehow we're going to earn our place back into the community. We're going to earn our forgiveness or something like that. And seeing that Jesus rushes out and he takes the shame of our sin upon his shoulders, right? He takes our punishment on our behalf, and he comes and he says to you, your past doesn't matter. What you've done, the ways you've messed up, that's not who you are. Put a ring on her finger. Put sandals on his feet. Clothe this person in the finest robes because this child of mine has come back home. To some of us, what Jesus would say today is the Father is waiting to reconcile you to himself, to his family, to the community. Not because of who you are or what you've done, but because the Father is compassionate. And because the Father loves you despite the ways you've messed up. And because the Father has a mission to seek and save that which is lost. Man, Jesus would want to communicate to some of us that there's a party just waiting for us if we'd only turn from our ways and walk back home to him. Maybe to some of us, he would say some of what he says to the older brother. See, if God has this mission to seek and save that which is lost, if that's his heart, and what we're called to is to have the heart of God, to see with the eyes of the Father, are we inadvertently getting in the way of people finding their way back home to God? How, you might ask? Well, maybe like the older brother, we just sit and stay silent. We know who God is. We know what he's done. We see others wandering astray. We see others wandering. We see others messing up their lives. And instead of working to reconcile the Father to this person that he loves, we do nothing. We sit and we stay silent. Or maybe we put stumbling blocks in the way of others because we say one thing, that we believe one thing, and then we go and we live in some way that's totally different. They know we go to church. They know we call ourselves a Christian, and yet we don't look any different than any of the rest of the world. We don't practice those fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. And so maybe in their hearts, they're like, you know what? I would really be interested in that idea of God if it were true. But if it were true, then shouldn't it have made a difference in your life? And because we do not align what we believe with how we act, we put stumbling blocks in the ways of people who are interested in this message of grace and forgiveness. Or maybe, most troubling, like the older brother, we've decided who gets to come to the party. And we've decided that people who don't look like us or vote like us or speak the same language as us or others who don't keep the moral code as strictly and as perfectly as we do, that they're not really welcome in the community, that they're not really welcome in the family. Instead of standing at the doors and welcoming in sinners to come and eat, we bar the doors and we guard the gates. There's another person in the story, the father. And I've got some bad news for you. You don't get to be him, right? You can see yourself in the story, but the father, that's the role of God alone. He's the one who throws the party. He's the one who reconciles those who are lost to himself. And you and I, we don't get to play that role, but we do get to join him in that mission if we choose to. It's his party. It's his invitation. It's his work on the cross through his son that reconciles a lost world to himself. And what he does is he invites us to come in and be a part of the celebration. If Bailey's right, and parables are this house that we have to get inside and explore and walk around in for a little while. If Caravaggio is right and we need to see ourselves in the story to more fully understand them, then this week I invite you to explore this parable a little bit and ask yourself, what would Jesus say if he was telling this story to me today? Maybe to some, it's time to come home and receive the reconciliation that God offers. Maybe for others, we need to be more intentional about joining God in his mission to seek and save that which is lost. Where do you see yourself in this story? Let's pray.